All right, welcome to my lecture on the Operation Spring Awakening or the Lake Balaton Defensive Operation. The goal of this presentation is to give you a historical background for those of you coming to reenact the 151st Rifle Division at Newville in a few weeks. But I'm also recording this lecture for everyone else for standalone viewing if you are interested in this overview of one of the key operations in the Second World War. A bit of a prelude. So the Red Army defeated the German Wehrmacht at the Battle of the Dnieper in the fall of 1943, and then in the Dnieper-Carpathian operation in the winter-spring of 1944. The 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts cut across right-bank Ukraine and into Germany's satellite states. After being freed from German occupation, Romania and Bulgaria took up arms against the Axis. By October of 1944, the 2nd Ukrainian Front stood at the border with Hungary, and by February of 45, the front surrounded Budapest and reached as far as Levice in Slovakia. The 3rd Ukrainian Front also came up from Bulgaria in the south and up to Lake Balaton in Hungary. It seemed that nothing could stop the progress of the Red Army. Here is a diagram of the Budapest defensive operation, so-called Stalin's ninth blow. Stalin's 10 blows being 10 very large-scale offensive operations on the Eastern Front that radically changed the strategic situation. And you can see how radical the change here is. This is an operation carried out by 3 entire fronts that advanced a depth of 250 kilometers. So, by the middle of February, the Red Army was hanging like a sword of Damocles over the Third Reich. Budapest, the capital of Germany's last remaining ally, was completely surrounded and under siege. Vienna, the capital of German-occupied Austria, was within reach of the Red Army, and any further progress would also cut off Germany's access to Hungarian oil, factories in German-occupied Czechia and Austria, and open the way for the Red Army to advance into southern Germany. But not even the Red Army at the height of its power could keep attacking forever. The forward elements of the 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts were tired and bloodied, and Germany finally had their chance to gather their troops and stabilize the front line. The German operation to do just that was called Conrad. The relative silence across the entire Eastern Front allowed Germany to start concentrating forces in Hungary starting in December of 1944. By February of 1945, almost half of Germany's tank divisions were gathered in Hungary, including the 4th SS Tank Corps that was previously busy keeping the Red Army out of Warsaw. So, Operation Conrad called for the 4th SS Tank Corps to punch through to Budapest and reestablish the front along the Margarita Line. Margarita Line is indicated in blue here, so you can see that it establishes a nice defensive line along the Danube, retakes Budapest, and even though Budapest is in that salient there, it's still a pretty decent defensive position. Time was of the essence, so the SS tankers needed to break through to Budapest and then return to Warsaw before the Red Army began its Vistula Oder offensive. This meant that they needed to go directly straight to Budapest through not great terrain for tanks. There was forests, there was mountains, poor roads, but there was not enough time to actually go around into better tank country on the other side of Lake Valence. There was also, very importantly, not enough fuel for that. The Germans at this point were not exactly in a great situation when it came to oil, and so had to prioritize the shortest route to the besieged city. Operational Surprise had to compensate for any of these other disadvantages. So, Conrad 1 begins on January 1st, 1945. The attack was rushed, so remember when I said that half of Germany's tank divisions were in Hungary by February? Well, they started quite a bit earlier than that. They only had about 30 to 60% of the arriving units fully disembarked. This force was still enough to sweep away the 31st Guards Rifle Corps, but the German attack still tipped their hand. 2 days later, the 4th Guards Army managed to regroup and form a coherent line of defense. And counterattacks into the German flanks slowed down the German offensive. Conrad I ran out of steam a week later without having reached Budapest. I'm not going to have time to go into details of all the Conrad operations, but this is just enough to establish a historical background for Balaton. So, Conrad II. Even before Conrad I had failed, the Germans tried again. They hit a little bit to the south of where the original attack happened, with the exact same plan to strike towards Budapest, reinforce its defenders, and reestablish a line of defense along the Margarita line. At this point, it was kind of obvious what the Germans were doing. A Soviet counteroffensive was ordered on the same day, but took until January 9th to actually pull off. Nevertheless, the German progress was slow, and the Germans decided to try for a third time, this time going around Lake Valence like they should have from the very beginning. This was called Conrad III and began on January 18th. This was an attack between Lakes Valence and Balaton. Here, the terrain was much more favorable for tanks. The roads were good, the snow cover was light, and most importantly, the Red Army was completely unprepared for an attack here because they figured, well, the Germans aren't going to try the same thing 3 times. However, this surprise attack was actually the most successful. The Germans actually crossed the Sharvis Canal and threatened the German Soviet positions west of the Danube. I'm apologizing to any Hungarians watching this right now. The Germans took Székesfehérvár on January 22nd. The Soviet counteroffensive against Conrad III began on January 27th, and that was really the end of Conrad. Fighting continued well into February, but Budapest was very clearly still very far away from the German lines. In the meantime, Pest fell on January 18th. That's the eastern half of the city, with the defenders retreating into Buda. Buda was abandoned less than a month later, and most of the garrison was either killed trying to break out or captured. This was a costly campaign. However, there were still some learnings from it. For once, the Germans showed that they're no pushover. They still have a significant amount of armored resources and, most importantly, the ability to deploy them. The Red Army is also, even after fighting a large and widespread offensive, is still a force to be reckoned with. You can punch through its lines, but you can only do so having gathered a significant armored force and deployed it properly. For the Germans, the most important thing that they found out was that the Red Army can be tricked. The deployment of the 4th SS Tank Corps actually happened in complete secret, and with any luck, they could pull off the same trick again. They also found where to attack. The space between Lake Balaton and Lake Valence was perfect tank country and was going to be a pretty good launch pad for a follow-up offensive. Now, since Budapest already fell, there wasn't really that much of a reason to rush into battle, and the Germans could take their time and make their plans. So, the follow-up operation to that was called Spring Awakening, Frühlingserwachen, which was also a very depressing 19th century German play. The goal of this operation was to cut off the Third Ukrainian Front from the Danube and destroy it, thus preventing an offensive towards Austria and stabilizing the situation at the front somewhat. There were 3 main prongs to achieve this. So you had the 6th Army and the 6th SS Tank Army between Lakes Balaton and Valence. They were going to attack both directly east to reach the Danube, and also southeast along that triangle formed by the canals there to cut the 3rd Ukrainian Front in half and limit its ability to resist any further. There were 2 smaller follow-up attacks, one from the southwest by the 2nd Tank Army, and one from the south by Army Group F. The 6th SS Tank Army gathers in Hungary under absolute strictest secrecy. The insignia are painted over, all SS units are referred to only by false names, and there is an active disinformation campaign that establishes a cover story that the 6th SS is being fortified east of Berlin in order to protect the German capital. SS units are strictly forbidden from using the radio or coming near the front line. The 6th SS Tank Army finishes transit by February 8th, with a whole month left to organize before the offensive. This ruse was actually successful. The Red Army did not discover the identity of the 6th SS Tank Army until the Germans actually attacked. However, they made a small mistake. The Germans sent elements of the 6th SS Tank Army into a skirmish of limited value near Esztergom on February 17th. And while the Red Army didn't know who these new tankers were, they knew that these were new tankers. And historically, Germany had never brought up new tank forces a long time before a new offensive. So the appearance of new tanks on February 17th meant that an attack was coming either in late February or early March. Every intelligence asset in the Soviet arsenal was activated to find out what's going on. In the meantime, the Third Ukrainian Front was ordered to prepare for a defensive. It's important to remember that the Vienna offensive operation was still the priority, so all newly arriving Soviet forces were earmarked for this offensive. The Third Ukrainian Front had to defend with what forces it had rather than receiving reinforcements. Speaking of forces, let's look at the breakdown here. Now, there was some difficulty finding these. Precise numbers on the German side were either never kept, which seems unlikely, or more likely, this information was lost. Mostly in this table, I'm going off of Szamveber's last Panzer battles in Hungary. The numbers here in the German column are forces used actively in the operation, rather than all German forces. They do not include the Hungarians, aside from the aircraft numbers, which do include the Hungarians. The numbers of the asterisks, they are estimated by Red Army Operational Research Department after the operation based on captured German documents. So here we see that in terms of manpower, the Germans were at a slight disadvantage. The Soviets had about 30% more men. That's again excluding the Hungarians. In terms of armor, the Germans actually had quite a significant advantage, about 2-1. Aircraft were about even. Artillery was about even. Mortars and machine guns, advantage one way and the other. I don't know why these were counted separately. Traditionally, in Red Army intelligence summaries, they were. So, since I'm a tank historian, we can look deeper into what the armor here actually was. I would like to start with a quote by Major General Tarasov, the author of the report on the experience of the Third Ukrainian Front in February of 1945, who wrote, "The enemy almost does not use infantry as an independent branch. All counterattacks were delivered with tank groups, covered by small amount of infantry riding on the tanks or in APCs." So, in Hungary, the Germans were very heavily relying on armor, and that's why the armor breakdown is so important. Rather than just the numbers, it's also important to take a look at the types. So you can see here that the Germans, aside from a 2-1 advantage in just numbers, have much heavier armor in general. So 1/4 of Soviet armor is light, 95 Su-76M assault guns, and I don't know where, but they found 4 American light tanks M3A1, so Lend-Lease is represented here. On the German side, very few light vehicles, 7 Panzer 2s and 3s. These were mostly Hetzers. Hetzers at 16 tons were quite a bit heavier than an Su-76 and had a lot more armor. 12 reconnaissance vehicles, didn't specify the type, unfortunately. Marder tank destroyers and lighter vehicles were not counted in this tally. And then on the flip side, quite a bit of the German armor is heavy. So on the Soviet side, 8.5% is either IS-2 tanks or ISU SPGs. On the German side, 30% of the armor is heavy. Now the asterisks next to the Tiger tanks, that's because there's different sources about how many of those there were as well. So Szamveber counts 33. If you actually look at the combat diaries of the Tiger battalions on the ground, they report 97 Tigers operational. Alexei Isayev counted 104 Tigers, plus at least 29 undergoing repairs. So anywhere between 30 and 130 Tigers, but still quite a bit of heavy German armor any way you count it. Tarasov actually noted that the attacking German force was larger than either of the two German pincer groups used at the Battle of Kursk independently. So put together, Kursk was still a larger tank battle, but Balaton came close. Another thing to consider is that the tanks were not evenly spread out. So if you take a look at the 57th Army in the southwest of the Soviet deployment, they were actually probably the best equipped in terms of armor, just because they didn't fight all that much in January and February. They were opposed by the German 2nd Tank Army here, and you can see that the numbers are a bit more even. The Soviet armor is still less numerous, and they're still lighter, but the numbers are a little bit more equal. You'll also notice that the 4th Guards armies all the way north there, they were mostly used to defend Budapest from the south. Their armor did not take part in Spring Awakening. So the Germans had concentrated all of their forces in one place, but the Soviet forces were spread out throughout the front. Tarasov estimated that in the area between Lakes Balaton and Valensay, the Germans had a 5-to-1 advantage in armor, a 2.3-to-1 advantage in men, and a 2-to-1 advantage in artillery. This is where I like to bring up a quote by Heinz Guderian. The German soldier is an excellent warrior and can be thrown into battle against an enemy with 5 times the numbers without hesitation. In this case, it was the opposite. It was the Germans who had a 5-to-1 advantage, and, well, if they were anywhere as good as Guderian believed, they would have won easily. So let's take a look at the separate parts of the battle. This is what I call the main direction of the attack, so the actual span between the lakes Valensay and Balaton. This is where the majority of the German forces were, and where the 151st Rifle Division fought. Then we have the south direction here. It was Army Group E against the 1st Bulgarian and 3rd Yugoslavian armies. Now, I would like to apologize to our Bulgarian and Yugoslavian allies. I don't speak Bulgarian or Serbo-Croatian. I don't have access to their archives. And for both the Germans and the Soviets, the battle across the Drava was a bit of a sideshow. Neither of them wrote all that much about it. Plus, from a strategic point of view, the German impact went about this far. So they didn't really affect the battle that we'll be reenacting all that much. On the southwestern side, the 57th Army fighting against the German 2nd Tank Army. I am also going to have to skip over this due to lack of time, but if you want to read about it, it's described in my book, Hetzer versus Su-76M, Hungary, 1945. Here, the German advance was also incredibly limited. They didn't even reach Kaposvar. They tried again a little bit to the north and failed again, and then had to retreat because the whole operation was collapsing. Spoiler alert. So I'm going to focus on the main direction where most of the fighting happened and where our favored division was involved. So the main attack began at 8:47 on March 6th after a 30-minute artillery barrage. The Germans couldn't carry out the bombing runs they wanted to because the bombers were impeded by low clouds and snowfall. However, the snow also hid the German tanks from Soviet artillery, which played into their hands. Balk's tanks struck right between the 4th Guards and 26th Armies, taking the shortest route to the Danube. The 155th Rifle Division of the 26th Army took the brunt of the attack. That day, the Germans only advanced 3 to 4 kilometers thanks to fierce resistance from the anti-tank gunners. In the direction towards Sese, to the southeast, the 1st SS Tank Corps attacked to cut across the 3rd Ukrainian Front diagonally. The Germans, similarly concealed by the weather, managed to get close to the Soviet defenses before they were seen. Two Soviet divisions, the 68th Guards and 233rd Rifle Division, take the brunt of the attack. Here, the Germans actually proceed quite a bit, and two tank brigades and an anti-tank rifle brigade have to be deployed to stabilize the situation. The Germans are still advancing. However, the right flank is vulnerable. The right flank was covered by the 1st SS Cavalry Corps, and when I say cavalry, I don't mean a bunch of guys on horses with swords. This was a mobile infantry unit with organic armor, including Stugs, Jagdpanzer IVs, and Hetzers. This was a very powerful and mobile infantry unit. And the right flank is quite a bit harder nut to crack than the center. The Germans wrote that the cavalry corps managed to move only 300 meters forward along the Siófok-Lipcseny highway. The enemy is constantly counterattacking from Enying. Another German quote summarizes the progress on day one. Tanks can move across cross-country terrain with difficulty due to heavy mud. All roads are turned into minefields and covered by enemy artillery. Infantry units could not achieve a rapid breakthrough, and fierce fighting led to heavy expenditure of ammunition, as a result of which the soldiers may end up without bullets. It was discovered that the enemy was waiting for our offensive and prepared for it, even if the exact start time and direction of the attack were unknown. That was a report by Otto Weller to Guderian. Even though the German progress was slow, they are still moving forward. The 1st SS Tank Corps continues to push southwest, reaching Szécely. They can't cross the canal there that day, but that doesn't mean they aren't trying their hardest. The 1st SS Cavalry Corps, reinforced by Hungarian assault artillery, is pushing back the 151st Rifle Division. They don't break through the front lines, but they are pushed back far enough that the Germans and Hungarians occupy Enying. The front line of the 26th Army is stretched to 20 kilometers. You can see all of this massive U-shape is defended only by the 26th Army. 90 kilometers, even for an army, is quite a lot. This is that triangle formed by the two canals on the map. I'm not sure if you can actually see my cursor, but you can see that it's a triangle pointed towards Szécely at its tip. The situation in the north is actually not that bad. You can see the Soviet defense in depth. The Germans are pushing due east, and even though they have that salient south of Lake Valensy carved out, they're quite a bit far away from the Danube. So the main danger at that moment is in the center at Szécely. Marshal Tolbuchin does not like the situation at all and asks the Stavka if he can commit the 9th Guards Army that was earmarked for the offensive against Vienna. The Stavka categorically forbids this. The attack on Vienna must begin on schedule and in full force. No resources that are prepared for the attack can be spent on the defensive. So not only does the Tolbuchin need to deal with the Germans on his own, he only has 1 week to do it to prepare for the offensive. So, March 9th to 11th is probably the most fierce fighting of the whole operation. Tolbuchin issues all of his artillery and all of his anti-tank reserves to beef up the defenses of the 26th and 27 armies. The last reserves are being used to hold the line at Szécely, not letting the Germans cross the canal while constantly sapping at the German flanks. Fighting continues day and night for dominating heights. This is what the terrain around Szécely looks like, so it's very, very flat. Even a small bump or hill, if you put an artillery observer there, can actually give you a pretty significant advantage. So for the Soviets, this no longer is a tank battle, this is an artillery battle. The Germans have such a big advantage in tanks that the only counter is anti-tank guns, particularly small, nimble, easy-to-hide anti-tank guns attacking at point-blank range. To prevent the Soviets from moving their anti-tank guns to where the Germans are about to attack, the Germans are forced to attack suddenly without a preparatory artillery barrage. Unfortunately for the Germans, indirect fire artillery is how you suppress enemy anti-tank guns, but that's just a gamble that they have to take. Here is the situation on March 10th and 11th. Pink on the map is March 10th, 11th is marked as orange. You can see that at the tip of the offensive, the Soviets are pushed back across the canal. The Germans are starting to gain ground. If they develop this offensive further, things are going to be really bad. On the left here, you can see the 151st Rifle Division is unfortunately still being pushed back. You can zoom in on that area of the map. You can see that the Germans have a foothold across the canal. The Red Army still holds some ground on the coast of Lake Balaton. But most importantly, the German foothold is still very small. It's constantly being pounded by the 151st Rifle Division from the west and the 66th Rifle Division from the east. And without securing their flanks, the Germans cannot begin an offensive here because they're going to get caught in a pincer movement from Lake Balaton. So this is very fierce fighting for not that much gain in terms of ground. In the north, things are still, well, not great, but you can see that the retreat is very manageable. Soviet forces are being pushed back, but they're being pushed back in good order. The defense in depth still holds. The danger of the Germans getting to the Danube here is not that high. The German offensive begins to stall. Hungarian assault artillery is being thrown against Siófok on the coast of Lake Balaton, but the 151st Rifle Division is managing to rebuff it. Whatever beachheads the Germans captured across the canals are under constant attack. The Germans are being forced to fight just to keep whatever ground they took, as opposed to advancing anywhere. Intelligence indicates that individual enemy units have ceased attacking and are now digging in for a long-term defensive. But most importantly, German reconnaissance reports 3,000 Soviet vehicles gathered near Budapest. That's because we're now 2 days from the Vienna offensive operation, and the Red Army is going to Vienna whether the Germans like it or not, as indicated by this absolutely massive red arrow here. On March 15th, there are some last-ditch attempts to throw the remainder of German armor into the beachheads to expand them, but all of them are rebuffed. And on March 16th, having advanced at most only 30 kilometers into Soviet lines, the German armor begins to withdraw. The Vienna offensive operation begins on March 16th, just going around the remaining German forces, having been delayed by 1 entire day. Here's a map of that area where the 151st was fighting, the left flank of the 26th Army. So you can see that they were ready to follow the retreating Germans. You can see that they've moved Siófok all the way down here, moved into German territory that they occupied just a couple of days prior, and are ready to chase them out of the gap between Lakes Balaton and Valency. March 24th, you can see Enying just way in the corner over there in the proverbial rear view mirror as the Red Army continues westward towards Vienna and southern Germany. Now, my favorite part is the blame game. The Germans don't take this defeat kindly and blame the Hungarians for not fighting very hard. There were reports, as far as I can tell, not actually true reports of Hungarian units surrendering or even changing sides and fighting for the Soviets. Those aren't true. Nevertheless, the Germans use it as an excuse to disarm their Hungarian allies, steal all of their vehicles, and use the Hungarian troops as labor squads. As far as I can tell, the Germans didn't think it was true either. They wanted an excuse to have more trucks. They were never particularly kind to their own allies. Running out of fuel, you kind of hear that one as well, that the Germans were doing quite well, but it was only because they ran out of fuel that the Red Army did as well as they did. The plan Conrad was specifically chosen over a different plan called Paula because of how much fuel it needed, or rather, Paula needed too much fuel, Conrad needed less. Operation Spring Awakening was very similar to what Paula called for originally, so there's no way the Germans didn't know how much fuel it needed. if they chose to carry out a fuel-intensive operation without having enough fuel, well, that's poor operational art, and that's on them. The one that you hear the most often probably is that, well, so what if they lost this defensive operation? They inflicted overwhelming casualties, particularly in armor, on the Red Army, and beat back the Red Hordes, if only for a little while. As we just saw, the Vienna offensive operation was delayed by only 1 day as a result of this counteroffensive. But maybe the Germans did manage to inflict all of these losses on the Soviets. Looking at the tallies, the Red Army reported 165 tanks and SPGs destroyed or in need of repairs. About half of these were T-34 and T-45 tanks. Very little was heavy tanks, but then again, the Red Army had very little in terms of heavy armor. This is shockingly close to the German claim of 203. Normally, German defeats of this scale are accompanied by buckets of Knight's Crosses handed out here and there for kills that can't be verified because the battlefield is controlled by the enemy. But it's actually not that bad of an overclaim. The Germans, on the other hand, admit to 42 tanks and 1 APC's total losses. So did they get that 5-to-1 ratio that Guderian was talking about after all? Well, let's look at where these numbers actually come from. 42 total losses only apply to the 6th SS Tank Army and only up until March 13th. It's also important to talk about what is a total loss, or total Ausfall, the German term. This means that the tank is completely unrecoverable. So it's burnt out, it's ammo rack explosion, it cannot be restored or brought back into service ever, even if it's taken back to the factory. This statistic does not include abandoned tanks, even if these tanks have not yet been recovered. This statistic does not include tanks that can be repaired, but there are no parts that exist to do so. So even though the Germans wrote off 42 tanks, 396 tanks and SPGs, plus 228 APCs were listed as in need of repairs. In need of repairs includes short and long-term repairs. Short-term repairs can actually be up to a month. Long-term repairs don't have a time requirement at all. So this might even be a vehicle that's so badly damaged it needs to be refurbished at the factory, and in Soviet practice, this would be written off as a loss. These vehicles maybe can be recovered with time, but with the Soviet counteroffensive happening, the Germans would not be able to recover them, and fat chance of that happening. If you're interested, I have a long interview with Military History Visualized over the concept of total Ausfall and how it gives a very strange and largely incorrect view of German casualties. So that'll be in the bibliography. But for us, we can say that the Soviets actually took great care to calculate the German losses. To them, this was basically a second Kursk. At the Battle of Kursk, the Germans used quite a lot of novel new armor, and it was important to pay attention to how this armor was defeated. So the Red Army took great care at evaluating the German armor that was disabled here, including taking photos. So if you've interested in the Second World War, you've probably seen these photos of German tanks with white numbers painted on the sides and white paint highlighting all the damage they received. These were taken around Lake Balaton, and they were taken by Soviet crews studying the battlefield. And you see the guy on the right over there with the camera. That's actually going to be my impression going into the event. So in this list of known photographs, there are 279 distinct tanks and SPGs pictured. The highest sequential number painted on the side is 355. So, with the Germans accounting for 438 tanks and SPGs, plus 229 APCs either destroyed or in need of repairs, The Soviet claims of 324 tanks and SPGs knocked out and 120 APCs knocked out is actually not that bad. It's lower than the amount of German armor that needs work, just because the German numbers include losses in column red 1, 2, and 3. There isn't really a way to differentiate which tank came from which operation. So in summary, the Germans gather up an absolutely massive force, rivaling that which was used at the Battle of Kursk a year and a half prior. The Germans have a significant advantage in every respect against an enemy that is bloodied and exhausted. And yet the German offensive runs out of steam within a week and manages to delay the Vienna offensive operation by just 1 day. The majority of the research for this presentation was gathered for my book, Hetzer versus Su-76M, Hungary 1945, which explores the battle at Lake Balaton through the lens of a duel between these two armored vehicles. Then, of course, the most important part, my bibliography. The URL to that video I was talking about is at the end there. I'll share these slides and I'll share that link as well. I will stop the recording now and open the floor for questions.